Oh, so now they get it. Now they finally understand. Funny how clarity arrives only after the noise dies down. Funny how certainty looks obvious in hindsight after the results have already spoken for you. For the longest time, they looked at you like a question mark that made them uncomfortable, like a story that didn't follow the script they were handed, like a problem they couldn't solve with the tools they trusted. And because they couldn't explain you, they labeled you unstable, impulsive, too emotional. Reckless, words people use when they're scared of something they don't understand. But here's the part they're only beginning to grasp now. You were never spiraling. You were recalibrating. You weren't losing your grip on reality. You were loosening your grip on everything that wasn't real to begin with. While they were watching the surface, you were working at depth. While they were reacting to appearances, you were responding to patterns. From the outside, your decisions looked abrupt, unreasonable, even self-destructive. You walked away from things other people would have clung to for safety. You let go of roles that gave you status but drained your core. You chose uncertainty over comfort, silence over constant explanation, distance over familiar chaos, and they panicked. Because when someone breaks away without asking permission, it forces everyone else to question why they're still standing still. They talked about you in lowered voices. They traded theories. They wrapped their fear in concern and called it care. "Are you okay?" they asked. But what they meant was, "Why aren't you doing what we would do?" They mistook your calm for denial, your restraint for collapse. They watched you stop reacting and assumed you were shutting down, because to them, growth only looks real when it's loud and documented. They didn't see the nights you spent thinking 10 moves ahead. They didn't see you running the same scenarios over and over, weighing not just what you might gain, but what staying the same would cost you. They didn't see the internal math, the quiet calculations. The moment you realized that continuing down the approved path would be the real disaster. From the outside, it looked like chaos. From the inside, it was precision. You didn't explain yourself because you knew something they didn't. Explanation invites interference. The more you tried to translate your instinct into language they could understand, the more they would try to talk you out of it. Their questions weren't curiosity. They were fear looking for reassurance. So you stopped narrating your life. You stopped performing your process. You let them think whatever they needed to think, because you were done outsourcing your decisions to people who couldn't feel what you felt. And they hated it. Silence breaks the illusion of control. Silence gives no handles to grab onto. When you withdrew, they filled the gaps with their own projections. Collapse, burnout, breakdown. They couldn't imagine that someone would choose distance deliberately, so they assumed it must have been forced on you. But you weren't falling apart. You were falling into place. Every bold move you made looked like a gamble to them because they only knew how to play it safe. They measured risk in social approval, in predictability, in consensus. You measured risk in integrity, in alignment, in how much of yourself you would have to betray just to keep the peace. And once you saw that clearly, the choice stopped being dramatic. It became inevitable. You trusted instinct over consensus, not because you thought you were better than them, but because you knew yourself better than they ever could. You noticed patterns they ignored. You sensed shifts before they became visible. You felt when something was off long before there was evidence to point to. They called that intuition. Crazy because it didn't come with charts or guarantees. But intuition isn't magic. It's pattern recognition sharpened by experience and honesty. You weren't jumping blindly. You were jumping knowing exactly what staying would cost. And to people who've never questioned the script they were given, that kind of move looks indistinguishable from recklessness. The person who leaps without thinking and the person who leaps after deep calculation look the same in midair. The difference is only visible later, when one lands exactly where they intended. Time did what you didn't bother trying to do. It explained you, slowly, reluctantly, without drama. While you were building quietly, while you were reconstructing yourself without announcing milestones, the narrative around you started to crack. The same people who questioned your sanity began noticing the stability you carried now, the groundedness. The way you spoke less but meant more, the way you no longer reacted to things that once pulled you into endless explanations. They started connecting dots too late. The move that made no sense suddenly made perfect sense in context. The distance you took looked less like avoidance and more like self-respect. The silence they feared started to read as discipline, and now they're adjusting their memory to fit the outcome, rewriting history to make it seem like they always believed in you, like they understood all along. But you remember. You remember the looks, the doubts, the way people treated your clarity like a phase they just had to wait out. And yet, you don't feel the need to confront them about it. Not because you forgot, but because you outgrew the need to be validated by people who only understand results. What they're really reacting to now isn't just your success or your stability. It's the fact that you didn't need them to get here. You didn't wait for approval. You didn't need consensus to move forward. You trusted yourself before there was proof. And that unsettles people who only move when permission has already been granted. They're realizing that what they called madness was simply courage operating without an audience. That what they labeled impulsive was actually long range, thinking they couldn't follow. That your so-called breakdown was a breakthrough that required you to let parts of your old life burn quietly so something stronger could take shape. You chose clarity over comfort. You chose alignment over applause. You chose the long view over the familiar. And while they were busy diagnosing you, you were redesigning your life from the inside out. Now, they're catching up. Now, the results are visible enough to be undeniable. Now, the same people who doubted you are asking questions, trying to understand the logic behind choices they once criticized. But the truth is, they're not really trying to understand you. They're trying to understand themselves through you, trying to see if maybe there was another way all along. And this is where the story shifts into a different phase, because recognition, when it finally arrives, sometimes it brings distance. Sometimes it reveals just how early you were willing to stand alone. You're not angry about being misunderstood anymore. You're aware that growth often looks like insanity to people invested in staying the same. Aware that being ahead of your time means being alone for a while. And aware that the calm you carry now was built in the very season they thought you were losing everything. They finally get it. Yes. But what they don't realize yet is that understanding is only the beginning. Because there's another layer to what you did. Another truth beneath the surface of all this recognition. A reason why your so-called crazy had to look the way it did. A reason why you couldn't explain yourself even if you wanted to. And here's the part they still don't fully understand yet. The part that hasn't landed for them, even now that the outcomes are staring them in the face. What you did wasn't just a series of bold decisions. It was an identity shift. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need witnesses. While they were busy arguing about whether you were right or wrong, stable or unstable, smart or reckless, you were shedding versions of yourself that were never meant to survive the next phase. That's what terrified them. Not the moves themselves, but the fact that you were willing to let old identities die without a funeral. Most people cling to who they used to be because it gives them continuity. It gives them a story they can explain at dinner tables, in interviews, in group chats. You didn't do that. You walked away from familiar narratives without replacing them immediately. You allowed the gap. You lived in the unknown long enough to rebuild from truth instead of habit. And to people who need labels to feel safe, that looks like instability. But instability is frantic. You were deliberate. Every step back you took was actually a repositioning. Every pause was reconnaissance. Every silence was you listening for what was real beneath the noise. You weren't confused, you were refining. You weren't stuck. You were deciding who didn't get to come with you. And that's the part they missed completely. They thought growth was additive. More titles, more approval, more visibility. You realized growth is subtractive, less noise, less explanation, fewer voices in your head that weren't your own. You didn't upgrade your life by piling things on. You did it by cutting away what diluted you. That kind of clarity doesn't look impressive in real time. It looks empty, lonely, questionable, which is exactly why most people never choose it. They kept asking, why would you leave that? They never asked, what was it costing you to stay? Because they've been taught to measure success by what's visible, not by what's sustainable. They can't see internal alignment, so they dismiss it. They can't quantify peace, so they devalue it. They don't trust intuition because it can't be crowdsourced. You did. You trusted yourself when the evidence hadn't arrived yet. You trusted a knowing you couldn't fully articulate. You trusted the discomfort of growth over the comfort of familiarity. And every time you made that choice, you stepped further out of sync with people who only move when the path is already paved. That's why they called you crazy. Because from their vantage point, you were violating the rules. The unspoken ones. The rules about staying agreeable, about not disrupting the group narrative, about explaining yourself until everyone feels comfortable. Even if you don't, when you stop doing that, you exposed something they didn't want exposed, that many of their choices weren't chosen at all. They were inherited, and watching you step off, script forced them to confront the possibility that they could have too. That's uncomfortable. So they projected. They pathologized. They reframed your courage as instability, so they wouldn't have to question their own restraint. Because if you were right, then staying safe wasn't wisdom. It was fear. And now the results are undeniable. Your energy is different, not louder. Not flashier, quieter. You move with less urgency and more certainty. You don't rush to be understood. You don't flinch when people misunderstand you. You've already survived that part. They notice how you don't over-explain anymore, how you don't seek reassurance mid-decision, how you don't perform your healing or narrate your growth. You just live it. And that unsettles people who are still explaining themselves to rooms that stopped listening years ago. Some of them are trying to catch up now. You can feel it. The sudden curiosity, the indirect questions, the "I've always admired how you" statements that conveniently forget the doubt that came before. Others are quietly backing away, uncomfortable, with the reminder that they mistook alignment for chaos. And then there's the third group, the ones watching closely, not because they doubt you anymore, but because they're trying to reverse, engineer you. They want the formula. They want to know how you made decisions without consensus, how you tolerated being misunderstood without defending yourself, how you trusted instinct without guarantees, how you rebuilt without applause. What they don't want is the cost. They want the outcome without the solitude, the clarity without the discomfort, the confidence without the uncertainty you walked through to earn it. They want the version of you that exists now without becoming the version of you that existed then. And that's not how this works. What changed your life wasn't certainty. It was commitment. You didn't move because you knew it would work. You moved because you knew staying would slowly erase you. You chose motion over stagnation, even when motion meant temporary chaos. You accepted being misunderstood as the price of being honest. That's not something you can teach quickly. That's not something you can package. That's not something that fits into advice. It's a threshold, and once you cross it, there's no going back to needing permission. That's why this moment, this delayed recognition, feels strangely hollow. Not disappointing, just distant. Because the version of you that needed them to get it doesn't exist anymore. That version did their job and stepped aside. You're operating from a different place now. A place where being right matters less than being aligned, where understanding is optional, where respect is nice but irrelevant to your next move. They finally understand, yes, but you're already ahead of that understanding. You're already asking different questions, quieter ones, deeper ones. Questions about what comes next, not what can be proven, but what feels inevitable. You're no longer interested in convincing anyone. You're interested in continuing, and that's the part that still hasn't registered for them yet. They think this is the end of the story, the moment where everything makes sense and settles neatly into place. They don't realize this was just the checkpoint, the pause before the next recalibration, the brief stillness before you move again. Without warning, without explanation, without asking if anyone's ready, because you don't wait for understanding anymore. You move when it's time, and that timing has never been theirs to decide.